Right. Hello. Welcome everyone to the fourth installment of our GGG AI for Science speaker sessions. Today's talk is on Acoustic AI, and we're joined by Tom. So Tom's a software engineer at Google. He's one of the organizers of the annual bird cliff competition, which is, for those who aren't aware, one of the big challenges on Kaggle, doing identification using machine learning models on bird species. And more relevantly for us, Tom heads the Google Perch team. So they develop a variety of machine learning tools for ecological purposes. And Tom's here today to provide us an overview of these tools and talk about some of the concrete use cases they've seen from his work. All right, thanks for joining us, Tom.
Unmute myself. Great. Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you for the intro. And then I might try resume presenting. I think that's the button we need. Can everybody see the slide? Great. Okay, cool, great. Yeah, so my name's Tom. I've been at Google about 10 years and have been doing bioacoustics in one form or another for about 6 years. And I've been leading Perch for 3 years now. So somehow managed to turn it into a full-time gig. I'm going to tell you what we've been up to, some of the ways we see the world. It's a little bit tough to give talks for really broad audiences. Like, I know there's some folks here that are coming from the ecology side and some folks that are coming from the machine learning side, and the questions are often really different. So I'm going to do my best to let everyone leave happy at the end of the day. Hopefully I at least partially succeed. I'll ask for questions a couple of times in the course of the talk. All right, cool. Can folks hear me? Okay, cool, great. So Perch, where do we start here? So this is, on the left, this is Rachel Carson, who wrote a book that some of you might have heard of called Silent Spring back in 1962. And that book was about the impacts of DDT and pesticides on ecosystems. The picture on the right is an airplane dropping DDT over just forests in Oregon, because apparently that was a thing people did at some point. And Silent Spring was one of the real things that brought to people's attention that this was a real problem. And in the mid-60s, somebody wrote to a forest manager in the US Forest Service asking whether the American robin was going extinct, because they were finding dead robins and broken shells just all over the place. And this forest manager thought about it and wrote back and said, we wouldn't know if the robin is going extinct because it's a common bird and there's no efforts to count common birds, right? So nobody's tracking this, so we wouldn't know if there's a catastrophic collapse happening. And that forest manager, so horrified by the response that he was forced to give by the state of affairs, went and started what's called the Breeding Bird Survey. And this runs every year in US, Canada. There's, I believe, an extension in Mexico as well that isn't pictured here, and has over 4,000 routes where people walk these routes and do point count surveys during, sort of peak breeding season every year. And each of these little squiggles, maybe there's 5 or 10 points, and you'll walk along it, you'll stop at a point, listen mostly, and record all that you hear over the course of about 3 minutes. And then at the end of the day, US Forest Service gets this enormous pile of notebooks and then turns that into statistical models for where are the birds, how are they doing, how do things look year over year. So that's been running since about 1968, which means we've got a really, really long data set for where are breeding birds in the United States and how have those populations changed over time. You can take the outputs of that and, as I mentioned, put that into some statistical models to start building things like this abundance map for a species called loggerhead shrike. So you can sort of see where it's concentrated. And because this has been running since the 60s, you can also do this over time and get these trend maps for, how is this population changing? How are those concentrations moving around or reducing in a lot of places over time? And if you take all of that data from all of that time and put it together over all of this space, you can put together some really big maps. And so this is I believe this came out in 2019. This graphic's from the New York Times, collecting some research that found that there was about a 30% drop in bird populations in the US and Canada since 1970. So about 3 billion birds lost. And furthermore, you can sort of see how this is broken up across different sorts of geographies, with grasslands being the most impacted. The one sort of bright spot here is wetlands. And one of the things that happened with wetlands is that this data in the 90s was used to really identify, like, hey, there's a problem here. When we call these things swamps, people tend to like fill them and destroy them. We should change the name and do a lot of restoration effort. And so starting in the 90s, there was a lot of effort on improving wetland habitats, and that's led to things being a bit better overall in that case. But overall, this is fairly horrifying. And if you look at this picture, there's two really big holes in it, not counting the Great Lakes. So one big hole is, the rest of the world. So everything that's not the US and Canada, which, hey, we're talking to Australia today, so that's relevant. And the other big hole is everything that's not a bird. And we've got some other indicators that things that aren't birds are having a hard time as well. So this was a study. This graphic is from a study, I want to say it was about 2022 or thereabouts. That was fine. It was a German group that was doing longitudinal monitoring of insects, put all of their notebooks together and realized that there was this massive drop in insect biomass over the range from 1990 to 2015 or so, it looks like, when they put this data together. So that's also horrifying, and may intersect what's going on with birds as well. If you have less things for the birds to eat, you're going to have less birds. So, okay, so that's the horrifying part. So where do we come in? So let's take a moment, close our eyes for just a second, take a deep breath, reopen them, and we find ourselves teleported into this rainforest. So we look around and we see a lot of leaves and trees. We see a lot of mist because it's a rainforest and it's very humid. But what you don't see in this picture are very many animals, right? But if we open our ears, we might be able to hear them. So here's an example of some, just random rainforest audio. So there's a lot going on in there. So multiple kinds of birds, lots of different insects. Could folks hear that, by the way? Just a quick thumbs up if you could. Okay, great. Yeah, and so you hear 10 times what you see. This is a particular birder that we've worked with over the years who does these point count surveys. 9 times out of 10, he writes down his first detection is coming from hearing rather than seeing the bird. So when we open our ears, we really open ourselves up to perceiving a lot of these animals that are communicating with each other and inhabiting these spaces. So bioacoustics then becomes a really nice entry point to understanding what's going on in ecosystems. For 20 or so years, it's been pretty feasible to take a microphone and staple it to the side of a tree, or tie it in this case. It's probably a little nicer for the tree. And leave it running for anywhere between a day and a month, or in the case of Paul, who's on the call here, years. And collect up that data and end up with more data than you know what to do with. And part of my job is every once in a while somebody just knocks on my door and says, "Hey, I've got 10,000 hours of audio. Can you tell me what's in here?" And then we try to get started on that. So once we start collecting this data and listening to what's in there and trying to decipher what's going on in these ecosystems, there's a lot of on-the-ground, high-impact questions for conservation that answers to these questions can help out with. So just to highlight some of these. So there's this effort, 30 by 30, to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. It's a UN priority. Lots of people working on it. And a big question that comes with that is, which land do we actually want to protect for 30 by 30? And, we can probably all agree that just concentrating everything around Alice Springs, though Alice Springs is beautiful, is not going to capture sort of the full diversity and range of natural systems in the world. So, you've got a sort of prioritization question, and understanding where biodiversity is a big part of that. There's questions around how to effectively monitor for destructive human activity. A group we worked with for a long time called Rainforest Connection was doing real-time detection of chainsaw sounds in forests. It's really important. We've also worked with folks on bomb fishing, and to a lesser degree poachers, but it's a thing people are looking for. Monitoring efficiently for broad biodiversity to understand best practices and sort of farming, coffee farms, these sorts of things. If you can proactively detect invasive species when the population is small, you can react to them at a much lower cost and more effectively than you can if they're already everywhere. I don't need to tell that to Australia. And there's, of course, a lot of questions with what's going on with noise pollution, and that's particularly salient in marine environments where sound carries further, tends to be a lot louder, and you don't have people complaining about it because, we're all the humans who write all of those complaints are living above water. So we don't tend to get woken up by the marine ecosystem sound, but can lead to things like whale beachings. Okay, so that's kind of why we want to do bioacoustics or ecoacoustics. Now I want to do just a little bit of a deep dive, because I'm a bit of a bird nerd, into like the full complexity that we're dealing with here. So sorry, I haven't fully customized my slides to Australia. This is an American bird called the white-crowned sparrow. And let's just hear what one of these lists sound like. This one's from Blaine, Washington. Play that one more time. Cool. So this picture that we see here, so this is the one we just listened to from Blaine, Washington, is a spectrogram. And on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have frequency. And then these darker parts are where it's louder. So what we're hearing here is this sort of flat opening note, and then this sort of buzzy sound, then these two downswept notes, then another buzz, and then 5 downswept sounds in quick succession. So let's listen to that. If you want to just focus on this sort of flat note and then the buzz at the beginning, that'll kind of give you the idea how this works. All right. So now we all understand how spectrograms work. And for the white-crowned sparrow, you might say like, hey, it's a bird, it makes a song, that's cool. But actually, there's a lot of variation here. And what we're seeing here is variation across different places. So Washington, Michigan, Missouri, Oregon are all different US states. The Yukon is up in the Canada. And we can see that, the shapes that these are making are really different. They all have this sort of opening long note, which we can use for species identification. But then there's a lot of variation from one place to the next. So there's geographic variation going on here. This example from Whitehorse, these are actually 2 different individuals, and there's some similar features here. They've both got these sort of 2 buzzes at the end, but there's actually individual variation as well. So we have geographic variation and individual variation. And we also have different kinds of calls. So not just the songs, but sort of these clicks that they give as sort of flight calls, alarm calls if there's a predator nearby, and then juveniles can have begging calls as well. So, so we can observe a lot of different things here. So pretty much every bird species is going to have multiple different types of calls. Those vocalizations serve a number of different functions. They might have more or less structure. They might be more or less typified. They might relate to mating and territoriality, but have a large range of other functions that they can serve as well. Got all of this variation. And furthermore, the birds are not really orienting their lives around making things easy for us as machine learning experts. So they tend to talk over one another and have all sorts of variations that are hard for us to deal with as people trying to build reliable systems. All right, one more slide of just like high bird nerdery, because I think it's fun. So what we hear is probably a bit different from the way birds are hearing it, right? So Dooling, way back when, did some study where he found the song Yeah, so audio time perception for songbirds may be 2 to 4 times finer than humans. So let me give you an example of what that sounds like. So here's a dark-eyed junco. So if your ears are like mine, you probably hear that as a bunch of like individual notes. Dot, 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 dot. Now, if you look at the spectrogram, that's not really what you see, right? And so let's slow that down by 2x and listen to it again. So when we slow it down, we can hear that 2-note structure. So those short down sweeps followed by the short up sweeps. And yeah, so there's a lot going on there that when we're sort of hearing this with our human ears, we're not necessarily hearing. Another favorite example, so this is a green-tailed towhee. Both of these are North American birds, sorry. So this one really just like washes over you. There's so much complexity. And let's listen to that one slowed down. And one of the pieces I really love in this song is these notes here are what we call polyphonic. So there's this sort of overswept like woo, and then an upswept note that's happening at the same time. So woo. Those are happening at the same time. And what's going on here is that the birds have what's called a syrinx, which is sort of like having your vocal folds after the point where your throat splits off for the lungs. So you've got sort of a different set of vocal folds for your left lung and your right lung. And that lets them create 2 totally independent sounds at the same time, which is what we're hearing in these really short notes here. So if we listen to that again at full speed, like, yeah, do you even notice it? It sounds a little squeaky to us, but there's some complexity there. And it's, you know, that's really fine structure that's there for a reason. So all of this complexity that we're seeing, you know, sometimes within a single bird species where there's, you know, different things going on within a species, different kinds of geographic variation and individual variation, we can take that and we can multiply it by the 10,000 bird species worldwide. Some are admittedly more complex than others, but there's a lot of range there and a lot of complexity and a lot of diversity. And beyond birds, we've also got 5,000 species of frogs and toads, 20,000 Orthoptera, which are insects, 1,400 bats, that's 20% of mammal biodiversity in bats, 400 primates, and somehow one primate in particular that seems to get almost all of the research funding. So, all right. So working with folks on biodiversity monitoring and conservation monitoring, we as machine learning folks, I sort of see 2 kinds of problems coming up. And they're really sort of different ways that you approach them from a machine learning perspective. So you've got broad monitoring efforts where you might want to identify what are all of the species that are present here that vocalize, that we know about, that we can actually get classifiers good enough to deal with. So sort of tell me everything that's going on in this ecosystem. And on the other end, you might be really interested in some particular species. So it might be like an endangered species whose population you really want to monitor, or an invasive species that you want to catch early. For that individual species monitoring, you might have a fair amount of money coming at the problem and a fair number of grad student hours that you can throw at it. And you really, really want to know if it's there or not. And so in that case, when we're building classifiers, we really want to get high recall first. So we want to be sure that we have caught it if it is there. And then we can burn some graduate student time dealing with the false positives and sort of listening and sorting it out. Once we know we've got decent recall, then we want to focus on improving our precision so that we save some of that grad student's time. But we really want to be sure that we find the thing first. For the broad monitoring effort, if you've got 200 species you're trying to monitor across a range of different sites, those false positives from all of those different species add up really quickly. And so for broad monitoring, we tend to maximize precision first So we really only want to know if we're pretty sure that it's there. And then once we've got a pretty precise classifier for this broad range of species, then we want to improve recall over time. And on the species monitoring side, the individual species monitoring side, we also often see like a lot of care about fine detail. So like, is this endangered species nesting here, or is it just sort of passing through? Is there a nest nearby? Can we tell that by hearing juvenile calls, right? So lots of specificity that can come in there. And working with lots of groups over time from all different parts of the world, one of the things we've realized is that the sort of process of like, okay, we as Google are going to like build a classifier and we'll throw it over the wall for people to use, that just doesn't scale because there's sort of too many problems to work on. And people are coming up with new problems all the time, species that we've never seen in our training data, very specific problems like those juvenile call detections that no training data exists in the world. So, we want to find ways to help people that requires less close involvement from machine learning experts. So I'm going to try to make myself obsolete first. And this leads us to this big question of how do we build a system to efficiently answer questions which have never been asked before, right? Specifically in bioacoustics. And so we stepped back and we looked at sort of what is the overall workflow of passive acoustic analysis. So passive acoustics, that's where you put the microphone on the side of the tree, collect your thousands of hours of audio. So yeah, our first step is we get a bunch of audio, then we get a bunch of training data, then we're going to train a classifier for those classes we're interested in. We're going to evaluate the classifier, decide it's no good, and then maybe we'll collect some more training data and train a new version, and we'll repeat that a few times. Then finally, we'll run inference over our thousands of hours of audio. And then after all that's done, then we can finally start answering some ecology questions. And a couple of our big limitations here are, this collection of training data and evaluation of the classifier, that ends up needing a lot of ecologist expert time, right? So folks that really know the environment, know the birds that they're working with, and can do that validation and training data collection. But from my perspective, those folks have a lot better stuff to do with their time than training classifiers on a day-to-day basis. We would really love for them to be more free to engage in the conservation work on the ground or build more classifiers, say, if just one isn't enough. And overall, the funding, like I said before, is going to that one primate for the most part. So we better find ways to use those ecology experts more efficiently. The other thing we find is that there's pretty limited machine learning expert availability. So folks tend to get pretty slammed and overworked as soon as they're putting out something that works. So we look at this workflow and, as machine learning experts, we're probably not the right people to be putting microphones in the field, but we can sort of focus on the central piece where we're building up that classifier and try to make that as efficient as possible. And the system that we've put together for this is called Agile modeling. And really what it is a combination of search with active learning. So we start with a robust pre-trained model to embed the target data, and I'll explain that in more detail in a bit. But that pre-trained model basically makes search really efficient. So you can show up with an example of what it is that you're looking for, and we can try to surface more examples of that within your thousands of hours of audio that you've collected. Once we give you the results from that search, then you can say whether those results are relevant, yes, yes, no, no, yes, no, yes. And then we can take those validations and turn those into a small classifier for what it is, hopefully, that you're actually after. And that iteration, so this process where we evaluate, train a classifier, evaluate, train a classifier, that's what we call active learning. So we collect labels, get a new version of the classifier, and repeat. And then overall, we want to try to make the system simple enough for anyone to use. And if we can do this well, then you don't have to wait to iterate on the model quality, passing it back and forth to like a different lab with machine learning experts in it, and figuring out data sharing agreements and all that stuff. Hopefully you can pick this up, use it with your own data, iterate quickly, and have a classifier up very quickly. And then mostly this whole process then ends up being those ecologists and ecology experts sitting in the chair working with the tools that we're able to make available to them. And if all that goes according to plan, sort of our goal is that people should be able to sit down with this and have a new classifier with about an hour of effort. And then once they have that classifier, be able to move on to those questions of, what's actually going on in the ecology. Okay, so I mentioned embeddings, so I'm going to talk quickly about what those are. And one way to think of them is sort of a fingerprint of what's in the sound. So our model works with 5-second chunks of audio. So we'll start with an input waveform. We'll compute one of those spectrograms that we learned how to read earlier. And then we have a neural network that's trained as a classifier. So it's trained on 10,000 bird species worldwide, mainly on data from Xenocanto. And the output of that classifier is a bunch of species probabilities. So we think 98% dove, 87% parrot, 0% koala for this particular audio bit that we've put in. And what we're going to do is we're going to throw away those prediction probabilities. And the embedding for us today, there's other ways to get embeddings, but for us today, it's going to be just taking the last set of activations out of the neural network before they get turned into probabilities. And this turns out to be about a 1,000-dimensional vector, 1280 if you're keeping score. So this 1280-dimensional vector, that's sort of the best vector you could possibly have for telling which of the world's 10,000 bird species are present in this 5-second chunk of audio, right? And really quickly, the model that we sort of have up on Kaggle Models that you can download and play with today, it's an EfficientNet V1, which is a slightly older architecture, but we can talk about that later if you like. We trained it on Xenocanto, as I mentioned. So there's about 10,000, I think closer to 15 now, of weekly labeled data that's collected by folks from all over the world. It's trained as a multi-class and multi-label problem. So we're actually mixing different clips together, and it tries to predict, which pairs of birds are present in a given mixture. And we train it with about 15,000 total classes, including a species, but also all of these hierarchical labels derived from the species. So it's also trying to tell what's the genus, family, and order. And mix-up augmentation I just mentioned, that's where we take multiple things, mix them together. And that's kind of the most important bit for improving the model quality. So probably about 1.5 years ago, we released this paper that showed that the embeddings that we get from this bird classifier are really, really good for novel problems. They organize the data effectively and let us say things about new problems that people show up with. So I'll spend a moment with this diagram. So this top chart, so this is a problem called Godwit call type. So a Godwit's a particular kind of bird. It has about 5 different kinds of calls that were in this data set. And we wanted to check whether we could use the embeddings from our model to recover the different call types. So you might be afraid that since this model is just trying to predict species, that by the time we get to that embedding, it really only knows about what species it is. So it might be like, hey, this is a Godwit, and anything about call type has been lost. So this was kind of the fire test. So can we tell what the different call types are from the embeddings? The answer is a resounding yes. So the y-axis here is ROCAUC, which is a quality score. Each of the different colored lines is a different embedding model. So ours, Perch, is the blue one on top. Yeah, pretty good. But the other one that's up there is BirdNet, which is also a great model, and they're really good friends of ours. So yeah, they're good too. The other ones are general audio embeddings from general audio models that were trained on mass amounts of YouTube data. So an audio MAE, which is sort of a modern transformer architecture, YAMNet and VGG-ish are slightly older convolutional models. Now, I tend to think of 0.9 ROCAUC as sort of like the threshold for usefulness of a model. So like once you get to 0.9 ROCAUC, things start being pretty good, pretty useful. The x-axis here is the number of training examples per class. So I mentioned before, there were just 5 call types in this data set. So with 20 training examples, we were already well north of 0.9 ROCAUC for this particular problem. And as we increase the number of training examples, it gets better. This bottom plot is a projection of the embeddings into two-dimensional space for a number of these different models. So the Perch model is all the way on the right, and YAMNet, which is one of these sort of lower ones, is all the way on the left. And that kind of tells you what's going on here. So we project down to 2 dimensions, and after we've done that two-dimensional projection, we color these according to which of those 5 different call type classes they came from. And what you can see is that the green and the orange and the purple and the blue and the red are really well separated from each other. And what that tells us is it's pretty easy to throw a plane between them in high dimensional space, which then explains why it's really easy to get good performance with not very much data. For YAMNet, on the other hand, which really struggles with this problem, you see this sort of muddy mess in the middle, right? So one of the takeaways here is that if your data, whatever your new problem is already really well clustered in that embedding space, you're going to have a really good time with a model adaptation. So Godwit call types, you might say, okay, cool, it's a bird model, whatever, that's easy. Let's look at some other ones. So yellowhammer dialect, all right, still a bird, but it's a much harder problem. So this is a German species that has geographic variation as well as individual variation. And the song has 2 parts. There's sort of a beginning piece that might be some individual variation or variation that we're not paying attention to today. The second part of the song, if it's a high note then a low note, you're in one part of Germany, and if it's a low note then a high note, you're in another part of Germany. And so that's what we were trying to recover. So high-low versus low-high in this other part of the song with other sorts of changes going on, right? So a pretty subtle change. And the answer was, it was a bit harder, right? We start off not acting very well, but once we get enough training data in the mix, then we start getting to that sort of decent quality threshold and then carrying on beyond. So, okay, really subtle bird problem, we can still do okay. Bats, so if you take this was a 4-species American data set where we frequency shifted the bat echolocation trains into the audible range so we could feed it into the model and still have something useful to look at. And we see pretty good differentiation amongst those species. You might say, well, bats fly too, so of course that's easy for the bird model. So then we went to marine mammals, and that works pretty well. So still doing pretty good, even though these are some underwater creatures. And then you'll say, okay, but that's still easy. Swimming is just flying underwater, so whales are basically just birds again. And then we go to frogs, and frogs, I'll argue, actually aren't birds. And we seem to be doing an okay job there too. And then this last one, the rainforest connection bird species. This was a number of bird species that just didn't have very much training data at all in Xenocanto. So you can think of it as sort of new classes. Okay, so we've got this good embedding model. Now, how do we make good use of it? So search is sort of my answer. So if we've got this well-organized embedding space where things are already sort of well clustered according to different sorts of properties, then we can use that structure to find new examples really efficiently. So we're going to create a big database of these audio embeddings. And then if you show up with a piece of query audio, so something you're interested in finding, we can then try to surface examples with similar embeddings. So this is a woodpecker drum. There's no woodpeckers in Australia. This is a terrible talk. I'm sorry, guys. And from this West Coast data set, we're able to collect a bunch of woodpecker drums. So here you can see some that are, concurrent with other sorts of things that are in that data set. Even though there's other things going on, we're still able to pull those out. And then these bottom 2, there's actually drumming going on there, but it's quiet and also masked by other things, including just background noise. So this search for embeddings ends up working out pretty well. Now you look at those spectrograms and you'll say, hey, those are way prettier than the spectrograms we saw before, like 3 colors, what's all that? So a thing we did a few years ago was build this unsupervised source separation model that helps us actually pull audio apart into different channels. And that helps us deal, in some cases, with this cocktail party problem where you've got lots of different activity going on at the same time. So we're going to have a callback to that first bit of rainforest audio we heard at the beginning. So it sounded like this. And the source separation algorithm, it breaks it apart into a number of channels, but here's a few that are extra interesting. So we get some insects that are kind of high-pitched. And we get that cackling bird. And then we get this sort of high-pitched bird that a lot of folks don't notice the first couple of times they listen to this clip. So just there. And let's listen to this one more time. You can see it in the spectrogram here, but let's listen to it in the original clip. So that works out pretty well. And in some of our work with Daniela Texera, looking for the glossy black cockatoo, which is an Australian species, got something for you. We found that this source separation actually helped the search quite a bit. So Daniela brought us this example of a glossy black cockatoo call. Sounds like this. Really quiet, so kind of a and then this chart, so this is from a 2-hour-long audio file, and each of the sort of ticks on the x-axis corresponds to one 5-second clip of audio. And up is good. So this particular little peak here near the beginning sounds like this. So that's the glossy black cockatoo. That's a positive hit, according to our expert. But these other two peaks back here that also look like peaks, turns out are not glossy black cockatoos. So there's a couple of things we could do. So the first thing we can do is take that original audio, that query audio, and separate that and isolate just the glossy black cockatoo. So if we listen to this again, you'll hear that there is another bird chirping in the clip. So there's like a little whistle in there, and so then that becomes a thing that we might find via search as well. So if we separate the query, we get sort of a nicer peak here. The other thing we can do is separate the target data. So take whatever the audio is we're working with, separate that into a bunch of channels, and then say, let's look at the best match we have across all of those different channels. And that gives us a really good peak. And then if we combine these two methods, separate the query and the data, we get this really, really nice peak and, sort of get rid of the noise entirely. So Daniela says, this is awesome, thanks, and found some super faint calls that are really hard to find when you're looking at hours and hours worth of spectrograms. So we were really encouraged by how that went. And then we made friends with Paul Rowe, I think probably at about the same time we met Danny. And Paul runs a project called the Australian Acoustic Observatory that has 360 microphones across the continent. And at the time that we put this together, had collected over 2 million hours of audio. I'm sure it's at least 3 by now. Paul nods in a resigned fashion. But we put together this search tool to try to make it more efficient to surface examples of Australian acoustics where they're interesting. So let's just do a quick demo of that, as it's fun. So I'm going to select one of my favorite examples. So that's a eastern whipbird, which is so called because it sounds kind of like a whip. And then I'm going to select this chunk of audio, and then we'll search for that. And now what it's doing is it's taking this clip of audio, computing the embedding for that, and then running this search over a chunk of the A2O data that we have embedded for this. And hey, we get a bunch of results that look a lot like eastern whipbirds. So we can get rid of a bit of redundant stuff. And sort of as promised, we're getting results even when there's other things vocalizing. We can get a map of where these results are coming from, which starts giving us a clue as to why this is called the eastern whipbird. And when we look down here in the results, let me see if I can find, there's a couple favorite ones I have. Let's try, let's do this one. So that second descending note is actually a female responding to the male. And then that ends up being a really interesting behavioral cue, right? So like which of these have a female responding and which ones don't. And that can sort of be the basis for a new search. So we can click on a button, and now this piece of audio becomes our search query, and then we'll start seeing results for that in hopefully just a moment. There we go. And we start seeing like, yeah, okay, cool. Here's some with responses. Here's a really quiet one that has a couple responses going on, and so on and so forth. We also get a few things that don't look terribly relevant, but hey, we've also got some sort of background vocalizations going on in this original clip. So we get sort of a mixture of results here as well. Right, so there's a little QR code if you want to go play with that. And I think we'll be sharing the slides afterward as well if you want to play with it. And we've got a bunch of cool features. I've shown you a bunch of the good ones here. It's great. From there, so we also have these Agile modeling collab notebooks where you can work with your own data. And we're actually continuing work with Paul and his group on making Agile modeling available via the Acoustic Observatory and their sister site, EcoSound, where you can sort of put your own data to work with. And we'll actually be doing a workshop on that at the Ecological Society of Australia in a few days, I think. I'll be in the US, but a bunch of my really good friends are going to be there. Other members of the Perch team, as well as Paul's team from the A2O. So this notebook is basically a way to take those perform those searches and build those classifiers that I talked about before. So from the search results, you can say like, is this a wood thrush or not? Yes, yes, no, yes, no. Get that classifier and then run that over your data. And it's available for free dollars. You can choose whether it's US or Australian currency. We've got a few other things that might be of interest to folks in the audience. So we have a paper we put out earlier this year called Birds, Bats, and Beyond that's particularly about evaluation practices for bioacoustics. We found a bunch of really interesting things like ROCAUC is great. I think was probably my biggest takeaway from that work. And another thing we worked on earlier this year is called All Thresholds Barred, where we want to estimate how many occurrences of a vocalization there are in a big data set without having to set a threshold on the detector. And this works sort of via some validation and gives us sort of an estimate of what the overall density of vocalizations is, along with a confidence interval. And then that ends up being really useful for things like correlating with abundance. There's a bit of follow-up work on that. And building other ecological models on top, understanding what the impacts of different covariates are. So this is just a quote I love from a really fun book, Karen Backer's The Sounds of Life. If you've enjoyed this talk, it's well worth picking up and reading. The microscope enabled humans to see anew with both our eyes and imaginations. Digital acoustics are an invention of similar significance. Today we're hearing things we never imagined we could hear. Yeah, so acoustics just opens up whole worlds, and our ability to listen to things at scale really changes the way we can relate to the natural world, IMO. So I've got a couple like just random things for machine learning folks, but I think maybe I'll pause here and ask if there's questions and go back to those slides if they come up, or otherwise just respond to what people are actually interested in.
Folks, if you've got questions, feel free to just use the raise hand button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, or throw a question into the chat bar.
Let's see. Yeah, so I find the Google Perch model a little inaccessible for computer scientists at the moment. Are there plans for non-conference workshops or clear instructions, documentations for how to use it? Any plans for a GUI? BirdNet could serve as an example here. You want to field this one, Paul? Or I'm not sure if Paul's allowed to unmute himself.
Sorry, I have the unmute. Sorry, what was the thing?
Are there any plans for a GUI or more accessible way to use the Perch model?
Yes, there are. I'm not sure we can say too much yet, but yes, there are.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that we're thinking hard about. We really want this to be accessible and in a way that ecologists, state agencies, conservation groups are able to pick it up and apply it to their data. Joseph asks, can you train a one-dimensional model on embeddings made for your training data and run inference on embeddings made from new data? Let's see, one-dimensional model. So by one-dimensional, do you mean for a single class or?
Joseph, feel free to just come off mute and ask. Maybe you can't find the.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. It was fantastic. I was wondering if you could create embeddings using Perch, for example, for your training data, so the one-dimensional vector, and then train a neural network just on those vectors.
Yes, and that's actually what we're doing in the Agile modeling flow. So sort of the way it works is we first compute the embeddings for all of the data. And then as we sort of get labels on some of that data, we just train a small model on top of the embeddings. And that's actually what lets us get the really high quality with so few training examples, because the embeddings are already sort of doing the work of separating things out.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. And then you could take embeddings from new data, from novel data, and run that into the model and just like any classifier. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's actually not required for data to be on Google Drive. I know we're doing that for the workshop at the ESA. It's really just a way to try to streamline things when working with a lot of folks. But we do work with folks who run things entirely locally. So like the University of Hawaii is a great example of this. They're basically running it on their own cluster and have their own giant piles of data. And, we actually don't even have a data sharing agreement with them, despite the fact that we've co-authored a couple papers. Yeah, and I guess that comes directly to this next question. Another question around data privacy. What data is being collected when the model runs over your own audio data? Is any of the sound data used via Google Perch stored or used for other purposes? So Perch, the model, you can actually download from Kaggle Models and just use that model on your own data. We're really happy when people do that successfully because it means that I have less work to do. And then I think for EcoSounds and the Acoustic Observatory, they have a API and a way to upload your data there. And then we'll have additional tools that make it easier to use. So there's a bit of a convenience versus, trusting other folks to look at your data problem there. But, we're really working hard to make sure that it's accessible via different means. Is Perch specifically birdie? Could that search be used on mammal vocalizations or even other ambient sounds? Yes, absolutely. So that picture I was showing before where we have bats, marine mammals, and frogs. So these are all using the Perch embeddings. So even though they're trained on birds, the enormous complexity and diversity of birds give us a way to bootstrap knowledge for other sorts of vocalizations. And I don't have my koala example handy, but searching for koala bellows on the A2O data does work. So good fun. And Anthony has a great privacy response for EcoSounds, which is the A2O sister site, that they'll calculate Perch embeddings for you, but only your project can use them. should be no issues. If you have any, contact us. All right. Good fun. Hope it wasn't too boring.
Thanks so much, Tom. Any final questions from anyone? Last chance to raise a hand.
Hey.
Go
Hi,
ahead.
Tom. Thanks so much for the talk. There was a question in the chat above that has our room very interested. What happens with bird mimics like lyrebirds?
Great question. Yeah, no one's held my feet to the fire on it yet and said, hey, I've got a bunch of mimics that are messing things up. So lyrebirds are interesting. There's a couple different ways that mimicry happens. So one is a case where you're like really actually trying to convince somebody that you're something else. And the good example I have of that is like jays in the US will imitate red-tailed hawks, maybe to scare away other birds or convince red-tailed hawks that they don't need to come around here. And then lyrebirds are interesting because they're actually doing this as part of their mating dance, right? And so what they're trying to do is demonstrate how good of mimics they are, how many different things they know for females, and not necessarily be really, really deceptive. So within lyrebirds, there's often some tonal giveaways that you can actually hear. And the first time I actually heard a lyrebird in the wild up in the Blue Mountains, I actually knew it was a lyrebird before I saw it because I heard a kookaburra that sort of immediately became something else at about the same distance and in the same direction. It was like, I bet that's a lyrebird. And indeed went around the corner and saw like the full display. It was amazing. And then Paul has a better answer than I do, of course. That yes, that does actually work.
There was a new question from oh no, hang on. It's oh no, we just covered William's question. I think that's it.
Cool. Yeah. Oh, and I guess William says Red Lord Whistler 5 calls on Xenocanto and it didn't work that well. We actually really love seeing negative cases because it helps us understand where there's gaps in the system. So if you want to reach out on the side and give some examples, I'd really be happy to take a look.
Rightio. Thanks so much, Tom.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
And the just a reminder that the recording and the slides will be available via the GDG event page probably within 24 hours.
Thanks, folks. That was great.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Cheers.